In Search of the Miraculous, Chapter 11. I am often asked questions in connection with various texts, parables, and so on from the Gospels, said G on one occasion. In my opinion, the time has not yet come for us to speak about the Gospels. This requires much more knowledge. But from time to time we will take certain Gospel texts as points of departure for our discussions. This will teach you to treat them in the right way, and, above all, to realise that in the texts known to us, the most essential points are usually missing. To begin with, let us take the well-known text about the seed which must die in order to be born. Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. This text has many different meanings, and we shall often return to it. But first of all, it is necessary to know the principle contained in this text in its full measure as applied to man. There is a book of aphorisms which has never been published and probably never will be published. I have mentioned this book before in connection with the question of the meaning of knowledge, and I quoted then one aphorism from this book. In relation to what we are speaking of now, this book says the following: a man may be born, but in order to be born he must first die, and in order to die he must first awake. In another place it says, when a man awakes he can die, when he dies he can be born. We must find out what this means. To awake, to die, to be born. These are 3 successive stages. If you study the Gospels attentively, you will see that references are often made to the possibility of being born. Several references are made to the necessity of dying, and there are very many references to the necessity of awakening. Watch, for ye know not the day and hour, and so on. But these 3 possibilities of man, to awake or not to sleep, to die and to be born, are not set down in connection with one another. Nevertheless, this is the whole point. If a man dies without having awakened, he cannot be born. If a man is born without having died, he may become an immortal thing. Thus, the fact that he has not died prevents a man from being born. The fact of his not having awakened prevents him from dying, and should he be born without having died, he is prevented from being. We have already spoken enough about the meaning of being born. This relates to the beginning of a new growth of essence, the beginning of the formation of individuality, the beginning of the appearance of one indivisible I. But in order to be able to attain this, or at least begin to attain it, a man must die. That is, he must free himself from 1,000 petty attachments and identifications which hold him in the position in which he is. He is attached to everything in his life, attached to his imagination, attached to his stupidity, attached even to his sufferings, possibly to his sufferings more than to anything else. He must free himself from this attachment. Attachment to things, identification with things, keep alive 1,000 useless eyes in a man. These eyes must die in order that the big I may be born. But how can they be made to die? They do not want to die. It is at this point that the possibility of awakening comes to the rescue. To awaken means to realise one's nothingness, that is, to realise one's complete and absolute mechanicalness and one's complete and absolute helplessness. And it is not sufficient to realise it philosophically in words. It is necessary to realise it in clear, simple and concrete facts, in one's own facts. When a man begins to know himself a little, he will see in himself many things that are bound to horrify him. So long as a man is not horrified at himself, he knows nothing about himself. A man has seen in himself something that horrifies him. He decides to throw it off, stop it, put an end to it. But however many efforts he makes, he feels that he cannot do this, that everything remains as it was. Here he will see his impotence, his helplessness and his nothingness. Or again, when he begins to know himself, a man sees that he has nothing that is his own, that is, that all that he has regarded as his own, his views, thoughts, convictions, tastes, habits, even faults and vices, all these are not his own, but have been either formed through imitation or borrowed from somewhere ready-made. In feeling this, a man may feel his nothingness. And in feeling his nothingness, a man should see himself as he really is, not for a second, not for a moment, but constantly, never forgetting it. This continual consciousness of his nothingness and of his helplessness will eventually give a man the courage to die, that is, to die, not merely mentally or in his consciousness, but to die in fact and to renounce actually and forever those aspects of himself which are either unnecessary from the point of view of his inner growth, or which hinder it. These aspects are first of all his false I, and then all the fantastic ideas about his individuality, will, consciousness, capacity to do, his powers, initiative, determination, and so on. But in order to see a thing always, one must first of all see it, even if only for a second. All new powers and capacities of realization come always in one and the same way. At first they appear in the form of flashes at rare and short moments. Afterwards they appear more often and last longer until finally, after very long work, they become permanent. The same thing applies to awakening. It is impossible to awaken completely all at once. One must first begin to awaken for short moments. But one must die all at once and forever after having made a certain effort, having surmounted a certain obstacle, having taken a certain decision from which there is no going back. This would be difficult, even impossible, for a man were it not for the slow and gradual awakening which precedes it. But there are 1,000 things which prevent a man from awakening, which keep him in the power of his dreams. In order to act consciously with the intention of awakening, it is necessary to know the nature of the forces which keep man in a state of sleep. First of all, it must be realized that the sleep in which man exists is not normal but hypnotic sleep. Man is hypnotized, and this hypnotic state is continually maintained and strengthened in him. One would think that there are forces for whom it is useful and profitable to keep man in a hypnotic state and prevent him from seeing the truth and understanding his position. There is an Eastern tale which speaks about a very rich magician who had a great many sheep. But at the same time this magician was very mean. He did not want to hire shepherds, nor did he want to erect a fence about the pasture where his sheep were grazing. The sheep consequently often wandered into the forest, fell into ravines and so on, and above all they ran away, for they knew that the magician wanted their flesh and skins, and this they did not like. At last the magician found a remedy. He hypnotized his sheep and suggested to them first of all that they were immortal and that no harm was being done to them when they were skinned, that, on the contrary, it would be very good for them and even pleasant. Secondly, he suggested that the magician was a good master who loved his flock so much that he was ready to do anything in the world for them. And in the third place, he suggested to them that if anything at all were going to happen to them, it was not going to happen just then, at any rate not that day, and therefore they had no need to think about it. Further, the magician suggested to his sheep that they were not sheep at all. To some of them he suggested that they were lions, to others that they were eagles, to others that they were men, and to others that they were magicians. And after this, all his cares and worries about the sheep came to an end. They never ran away, but quietly awaited the time when the magician would require their flesh and skins. This tale is a very good illustration of man's position. In so-called occult literature, you have probably met with the expression Kundalini, the fire of Kundalini, or the serpent of Kundalini. This expression is often used to designate some kind of strange force which is present in man and which can be awakened. But none of the known theories gives the right explanation of the force of Kundalini. Sometimes it is connected with sex energy, that is, with the idea of the possibility of using sex energy for other purposes. This latter is entirely wrong, because Kundalini can be in anything. And, above all, Kundalini is not anything desirable or useful for man's development. It is very curious how these occultists have got hold of the word from somewhere, but have completely altered its meaning, and from a very dangerous and terrible thing have made something to be hoped for and to be awaited as some blessing. In reality, Kundalini is the power of imagination, the power of fantasy, which takes the place of a real function. When a man dreams instead of acting, when his dreams take the place of reality, when a man imagines himself to be an eagle, a lion, or a magician, it is the force of Kundalini acting in him. Kundalini can act in all centres, and with its help all the centres can be satisfied with the imaginary instead of the real. A sheep which considers itself a lion or a magician lives under the power of Kundalini. Kundalini is a force put into men in order to keep them in their present state. If men could really see their true position and could understand all the horror of it, they would be unable to remain where they are even for 1 second. They would begin to seek a way out, and they would quickly find it, because there is a way out. But men fail to see it simply because they are hypnotized. Kundalini is the force that keeps them in a hypnotic state. To awaken for man means to be dehypnotized. In this lies the chief difficulty, and this also lies the guarantee of its possibility, for there is no organic reason for sleep, and man can awaken. Theoretically he can, but practically it is almost impossible, because as soon as a man awakens for a moment and opens his eyes, all the forces that caused him to fall asleep begin to act upon him with tenfold energy, and he immediately falls asleep again, very often dreaming that he is awake or is awakening. There are certain states in ordinary sleep in which a man wants to awaken but cannot. He tells himself that he is awake, but in reality he continues to sleep, and this can happen several times before he finally awakes. But in ordinary sleep, once he is awake, he is in a different state. In hypnotic sleep the case is otherwise. There are no objective characteristics, at any rate not at the beginning of awakening. A man cannot pinch himself in order to make sure that he is not asleep. And if, which God forbid, a man has heard anything about objective characteristics, Kundalini at once transforms it all into imagination and dreams. Only a man who fully realizes the difficulty of awakening can understand the necessity of long and hard work in order to awake. Speaking in general, what is necessary to awake a sleeping man? A good shock is necessary. But when a man is fast asleep, one shock is not enough. A long period of continual shocks is needed. Consequently, there must be somebody to administer these shocks. I have said before that if a man wants to awaken, he must hire somebody who will keep on shaking him for a long time. And who can he hire if everyone is asleep? A man will hire somebody to wake him up, but this one also falls asleep. What is the use of such a man? And a man who can really keep awake will probably refuse to waste his time in waking others up. He may have his own, much more important work to do. There is also the possibility of being awakened by mechanical means. A man may be awakened by an alarm clock, but the trouble is that a man gets accustomed to the alarm clock far too quickly. He ceases to hear it. Many alarm clocks are necessary, and always new ones. Otherwise a man must surround himself with alarm clocks, which will prevent him sleeping. But here again there are certain difficulties. Alarm clocks must be wound up. In order to wind them up, one must remember about them. In order to remember, one must wake up often. But what is still worse, a man gets used to all alarm clocks, and after a certain time he only sleeps the better for them. Therefore, alarm clocks must be constantly changed. New ones must be continually invented. In the course of time, this may help a man to awaken, but there is very little chance of a man doing all the work of winding up, inventing, and changing clocks all by himself, without outside help. It is much more likely that he will begin this work and that it will afterwards pass into sleep. And in sleep he will dream of inventing alarm clocks, of winding them up and changing them, and simply sleep all the sounder for it. Therefore, in order to awaken, a combination of efforts is needed. It is necessary that somebody should wake the man up. It is necessary that somebody should look after the man who wakes him. It is necessary to have alarm clocks, and it is also necessary continually to invent new alarm clocks. But in order to achieve all this and to obtain results, a certain number of people must work together. One man can do nothing. Before anything else, he needs help, but help cannot come to one man alone. Those who are able to help put a great value on their time, and of course they would prefer to help, say, 20 or 30 people who want to awake rather than one man. Moreover, as has been said earlier, one man can easily deceive himself about his awakening and take for awakening simply a new dream. If several people decide to struggle together against sleep, they will wake each other. It may often happen that 20 of them will sleep, but the 21st will be awake, and he will wake the rest up. It is exactly the same thing with alarm clocks. One man will invent one alarm clock, another man will invent another. Afterwards they can make an exchange. Altogether they can be of very great help one to another, and without this help no one can attain anything. Therefore, a man who wants to awake must look for other people who also want to awake and work together with them. This, however, is easier said than done, because to start such work and to organise it requires a knowledge which an ordinary man cannot possess. The work must be organised and it must have a leader. Only then can it produce the results expected of it. Without these conditions, no efforts can result in anything whatever. Men may torture themselves, but these tortures will not make them awake. This is the most difficult of all for certain people to understand. By themselves and on their own initiative, they may be capable of great efforts and great sacrifices. But because their first effort and their first sacrifice ought to be obedience, nothing on earth will induce them to obey another. And they do not want to reconcile themselves to the thought that all their efforts and all their sacrifices are useless. Work must be organised, and it can be organised only by a man who knows its problems and its aims, who knows its methods, by a man who has in his time passed through such organised work himself. A man usually begins his studies in a small group. This group is generally connected with a whole series of similar groups on different levels which, taken together, constitute what may be called a preparatory school. The first and most important feature of groups is the fact that groups are not constituted according to the wish and choice of their members. Groups are constituted by the teacher, who selects types which, from the point of view of his aims, can be useful to one another. No work of groups is possible without a teacher. The work of groups with a wrong teacher can produce only negative results. The next important feature of group work is that groups may be connected with some aim of which those who are beginning work in them have no idea whatever, and which cannot even be explained to them until they understand the essence and the principles of the work and the ideas connected with it. But this aim towards which, without knowing it, they are going and which they are serving, is the necessary balancing principle in their own work. Their first task is to understand this aim, that is, the aim of the teacher. When they have understood this aim, although at first not fully, their own work becomes more conscious and consequently can give better results. But, as I've already said, it often happens that the aim of the teacher cannot be explained at the beginning. Therefore, the first aim of a man beginning work in a group should be self-study. The work of self-study can proceed only in properly organised groups. One man alone cannot see himself. But when a certain number of people unite together for this purpose, they will even involuntarily help one another. It is a common characteristic of human nature that a man sees the faults of others more easily than he sees his own. At the same time, on the path of self-study, he learns that he himself possesses all the faults that he finds in others. But there are many things that he does not see in himself, whereas in other people he begins to see them. But, as I have just said, in this case, he knows that these features are his own. Thus, other members of the group serve him as mirrors in which he sees himself. But, of course, in order to see himself in other people's faults, and not merely to see the faults of others, a man must be very much on his guard against, and be very sincere with, himself. He must remember that he is not one, that one part of him is the man who wants to awaken, and the other part is Ivanov, Petrov or Zakharov, who has no desire whatever to awaken, and who has to be awakened by force. A group is usually a pact concluded between the eyes of a certain group of people to make a common struggle against Ivanov, Petrov and Zakharov, that is, against their own false personalities. Let us take Petrov. Petrov consists of two parts, I and Petrov. But I is powerless against Petrov. Petrov is the master. Suppose there are 20 people. 20 I's now begin to struggle against one Petrov. They may now prove to be stronger than he is. At any rate, they can spoil his sleep. He will no longer be able to sleep as peacefully as he did before. And this is the whole aim. Furthermore, in the work of self-study, one man begins to accumulate material resulting from self-observation. 20 people will have 20 times as much material, and every one of them will be able to use the whole of this material because the exchange of observations is one of the purposes of the group's existence. When a group is being organised, its members have certain conditions put before them. In the first place, conditions general for all members, and secondly, individual conditions for individual members. General conditions at the beginning of the work are usually of the following kind. First of all, it is explained to all the members of the group that they must keep secret everything they hear or learn in the group, and not only while they are members of it, but forever afterwards. This is an indispensable condition whose idea should be clear to them from the very beginning. In other words, it should be clear to them that in this there is no attempt whatever to make a secret of what is not essentially a secret. Neither is there any deliberate intention to deprive them of the right to exchange views with those near to them or with their friends. The idea of this restriction consists in the fact that they are unable to transmit correctly what is said in the groups. They very soon begin to learn from their own personal experience how much effort, how much time, and how much explaining is necessary in order to grasp what is said in groups. It becomes clear to them that they are unable to give their friends a right idea of what they have learned themselves. At the same time, also, they begin to understand that by giving their friends wrong ideas, they shut them off from any possibility of approaching the work at any time or of understanding anything in connection with the work, to say nothing of the fact that in this way they are creating very many difficulties and even very much unpleasantness for themselves in the future. If a man in spite of this tries to transmit what he hears in groups to his friends, he will very quickly be convinced that attempts in this direction give entirely unexpected and undesirable results. Either people begin to argue with him, and without wanting to listen to him, expect him to listen to their theories, or they misinterpret everything he tells them, attach an entirely different meaning to everything they hear from him. In seeing this and understanding the uselessness of such attempts, a man begins to see one aspect of this restriction. The other, and no less important side, consists in the fact that it is very difficult for a man to keep silent about things that interest him. He would like to speak about them to everyone with whom he is accustomed to share his thoughts, as he calls it. This is the most mechanical of all desires, and in this case silence is the most difficult abstinence of all. But if a man understands this, or at least if he follows this rule, it will constitute for him the best exercise possible for self-remembering and for the development of will. Only a man who can be silent when it is necessary can be master of himself. But for many people it is very difficult to reconcile themselves to the thought that one of their chief characteristics consists in undue talkativeness, especially for people who are accustomed to regard themselves as serious or sound persons, or for those who regard themselves as silent persons who are fond of solitude and reflection. And for this reason this demand is especially important. In remembering about this and in carrying it out, a man begins to see sides of himself which he never noticed before. The next demand which is made of the members of a group is that they must tell the teacher of the group the whole truth. This also must be clearly and properly understood. People do not realise what a big place in their lives is occupied by lying, or even if only by the suppression of the truth. People are unable to be sincere either with themselves or with others. They do not even understand that to learn to be sincere when it is necessary is one of the most difficult things on earth. They imagine that to speak or not to speak the truth, to be or not to be sincere, depends upon them. Therefore they have to learn this, and learn it first of all in relation to the teacher of the work. Telling the teacher a deliberate lie or being insincere with him or suppressing something makes their presence in the group completely useless, and is even worse than being rude or uncivil to him or in his presence. The next demand made of members of a group is that they must remember why they came to the group. They came to learn and to work on themselves, and to learn and to work not as they understand it themselves, but as they are told to. If, therefore, once they are in the group, they begin to feel or to express mistrust towards the teacher, to criticise his actions, to find that they understand better how the group should be conducted, and especially if they show lack of external considerings in relation to the teacher, lack of respect for him, asperity, impatience, tendency to argument, this at once puts an end to any possibility of work. For work is possible only as long as people remember that they have come to learn and not to teach. If a man begins to distrust the teacher becomes unnecessary to him, and he becomes unnecessary to the teacher. And in this event it is better for him to go and look for another teacher or try to work without one. This will do him no good, but in any case it will do no less harm than lying, suppression or resistance or mistrust of the teacher. In addition to these fundamental demands, it is of course presumed that the members of the group must work. If they merely frequent the group and do not work but merely imagine that they are working, or if they regard as work their mere presence in the group, or, as often happens, if they look upon their presence in the group as a pastime, if they make pleasant acquaintances and so on, then their presence in the group likewise becomes completely useless. And the sooner they are sent away or leave of their own accord, the better it will be for them and for the others. The fundamental demands which have been enumerated provide the material for rules which are obligatory for all members of a group. In the first place, rules help everyone who wants to work to avoid everything that may hinder him or do harm to his work. And secondly, they help him to remember himself. It very often happens that at the beginning of the work, the members of a group do not like some or other of the rules, and they even ask, "Can we not work without rules?" Rules seem to them to be an unnecessary constraint on their freedom, or a tiresome formality, and to be reminded about rules seems to them to be ill will or dissatisfaction on the part of the teacher. In reality, rules are the chief and the first help that they get from the work. It stands to reason that rules do not pursue the object of affording them amusement or satisfaction, or of making things more easy for them. Rules pursue a definite aim, to make them behave as they would behave if they were, that is, if they remembered themselves and realised how they ought to behave with regard to people outside the work, to people in the work, and to the teacher. If they remembered themselves and realised this, rules would not be necessary for them. But they are not able to remember themselves and understand this at the beginning of work, so that rules are indispensable, although rules can never be either easy, pleasant or comfortable. On the contrary, they ought to be difficult, unpleasant and uncomfortable, otherwise they would not answer their purpose. Rules are the alarm clocks which wake the sleeping man. But the man, opening his eyes for a second, is indignant with that alarm clock and asks, "Can one not awaken without alarm clocks?" Besides these general rules, there are certain individual conditions which are given to each person separately, and which are generally connected with his chief fault or chief feature. This requires some explanation. Every man has a certain feature in his character which is central. It is like an axle round which all his false personality revolves. Every man's personal work must consist in struggling against this chief fault. This explains why there can be no general rules of work, and why all systems that attempt to evolve such rules either lead to nothing or cause harm. How can there be general rules? What is useful for one is harmful for another. One man talks too much, he must learn to keep silent. Another man is silent when he ought to talk, and he must learn to talk. And so it is always and in everything. General rules for the work of groups refer to everyone. Personal directions can only be individual. In this connection again, a man cannot find his own chief feature, his chief fault by himself. This is practically a law. The teacher has to point out this feature to him and show him how to fight against it. No one else but the teacher can do this. The study of the chief fault and the struggle against it constitute, as it were, each man's individual path, but the aim must be the same for all. This aim is the realization of one's nothingness. Only when a man has truly and sincerely arrived at the conviction of his own helplessness and nothingness, and only when he feels it constantly, will he be ready for the next and much more difficult stages of the work. All that has been said up till now refers to real groups connected with real concrete work, which in its turn is connected with what has been called the fourth way. But there are many imitation ways, imitation groups and imitation work. These are not even black magic. Questions have often been asked at these lectures as to what is black magic, and I have replied that there is neither red, green nor yellow magic. There is mechanics, that is, what happens, and there is doing. Doing is magic, and doing can be only of one kind. There cannot be two kinds of doing. But there can be a falsification, an imitation of the outward appearance of doing, which cannot give any objective results, but which can deceive naive people and produce in them faith, infatuation, enthusiasm, and even fanaticism. This is why in true work, that is, in true doing, the producing of infatuation in people is not allowed. What you call black magic is based on infatuation and on playing upon human weaknesses. Black magic does not in any way mean magic of evil. I've already said earlier that no one ever does anything for the sake of evil, in the interest of evil. Everyone always does everything in the interest of good as he understands it. In the same way, it is quite wrong to assert that black magic must necessarily be egotistical, that in black magic a man strives after some results for himself. This is quite wrong. Black magic may be quite altruistic, may strive after the good of humanity, or after the salvation of humanity from real or imaginary evils. But what can be called black magic has always one definite characteristic. This characteristic is the tendency to use people for some, even the best of aims, without their knowledge and understanding, either by producing in them faith and infatuation, or by acting upon them through fear. But it must be remembered in this connection that a black magician, whether good or evil, has at all events been at a school. He has learned something, has heard something, knows something. He is simply a half-educated man who has either been turned out of a school, or who has himself left a school having decided that he already knows enough, that he does not want to be in subordination any longer, and that he can work independently and even direct the work of others. All work of this kind can produce only subjective results, that is to say, it can only increase deception and increase sleep instead of decreasing them. Nevertheless, something can be learned from a black magician, although in the wrong way. He can sometimes by accident even tell the truth. That is why I say that there are many things worse than black magic. Such are various occult and theosophical societies and groups. Not only have their teachers never been at a school, but they have never even met anyone who has been near a school. Their work simply consists in aping. But imitation work of this kind gives a great deal of self-satisfaction. One man feels himself to be a teacher, others feel that they are pupils, and everyone is satisfied. No realization of one's nothingness can be got here, and if people affirm that they have it, it is all illusion and self-deception, if not plain deceit. On the contrary, instead of realizing their own nothingness, the members of such circles acquire a realization of their own importance and a growth of false personality. At first it is very difficult to verify whether the work is right or wrong, whether the directions received are correct or incorrect. The theoretical part of the work may prove useful in this respect, because a man can judge more easily from this aspect of it. He knows what he knows and what he does not know. He knows what can be learned by ordinary means and what cannot. And if he learns something new, something that cannot be learned in the ordinary way from books and so on, this, to a certain extent, is a guarantee that the other, the practical side, may also be right. But this, of course, is far from being a full guarantee, because here also mistakes are possible. All occult and spiritualistic societies and circles assert that they possess a new knowledge, and there are people who believe it. In properly organised groups, no faith is required. What is required is simply a little trust, and even that only for a little while, for the sooner a man begins to verify all he hears, the better it is for him. The struggle against the false I, against one's chief feature or chief fault, is the most important part of the work, and it must proceed in deeds, not in words. For this purpose, the teacher gives each man definite tasks which require, in order to carry them out, the conquest of his chief feature. When a man carries out these tasks, he struggles with himself, works on himself. If he avoids the tasks, tries not to carry them out, it means that either he does not want to, or that he cannot work. As a rule, only very easy tasks are given at the beginning, which the teacher does not even call tasks, but he does not say much about them, but gives them in the form of hints. If he sees that he is understood and that the tasks are carried out, he passes on to more and more difficult ones. More difficult tasks, although they are only subjectively difficult, are called barriers. The peculiarity of barriers consists in the fact that, having surmounted a serious barrier, a man can no longer return to ordinary sleep, to ordinary life, and if, having passed the first barrier, he feels afraid of those that follow and does not go on, he stops, so to speak, between two barriers and is unable to move either backwards or forwards. This is the worst thing that can happen to a man. Therefore the teacher is usually very careful in the choice of tasks and barriers. In other words, he takes the risks of giving definite tasks requiring the conquest of inner barriers only to those people who have already shown themselves sufficiently strong on small barriers. It often happens that, having stopped before some barrier, usually the smallest and the most simple, people turn against the work, against the teacher, and against other members of the group, and accuse them of the very thing that is becoming revealed to them in themselves. Sometimes they repent later and blame themselves, then they again blame others, then they repent once more, and so on. But there is nothing that shows up a man better than his attitude towards the work, and the teacher after he has left it. Sometimes such tests are arranged intentionally. A man is placed in such a position that he is obliged to leave, and he is fully justified in having a grievance either against the teacher or against some other person. And then he is watched to see how he will behave. A decent man will behave decently even if he thinks that he is being treated unjustly or wrongly. But many people in such circumstances show a side of their nature which otherwise they would never show, and at times it is a necessary means for exposing a man's nature. So long as you are good to a man, he is good to you. But what will he be like if you scratch him a little? But this is not the chief thing. The chief thing is his own personal attitude, his own valuation of the ideas which he receives or has received, and his keeping or losing this valuation. A man may think for a long time, and quite sincerely, that he wants to work, and even make great efforts. And then he may throw up everything, and even definitely go against the work, justify himself, invent various fabrications, deliberately ascribe a wrong meaning to what he has heard, and so on. "What happens to them for this?" asked one of the audience. "Nothing. What could happen to them?" said G. "They are their own punishment, and what punishment could be worse?" "It is impossible to describe in full the way work in a group is conducted," continued G. "One must go through it. All that has been said up to now are only hints, the true meaning of which will only be revealed to those who go on with the work and learn from experience what barriers mean and what difficulties they represent. Speaking in general, the most difficult barrier is the conquest of lying. A man lies so much and so constantly both to himself and to others that he ceases to notice it. Nevertheless, lying must be conquered, and the first effort required of a man is to conquer lying in relation to the teacher. A man must either decide at once to tell him nothing but the truth, or at once give up the whole thing. You must realise that the teacher takes a very difficult task upon himself, the cleaning and the repair of human machines. Of course, he accepts only those machines that are within his power to mend. If something essential is broken or put out of order in the machine, then he refuses to take it. But even such machines, which by their nature could still be cleaned, become quite hopeless if they begin to tell lies. A lie to the teacher, even the most insignificant, concealment of any kind, such as the concealment of something another has asked to be kept secret, or of something the man himself has said to another, at once puts an end to the work of that man, especially if he has previously made any efforts. Here is something you must bear in mind. Every effort a man makes increases the demands made upon him. So long as a man has not made any serious efforts, the demands made upon him are very small. But his efforts immediately increase the demands made upon him, and the greater the efforts that are made, the greater the new demands. At this stage, people very often make a mistake that is constantly made. They think that the efforts they have previously made, their former merits, so to speak, give them some kind of rights or advantage, diminish the demands to be made upon them, and constitute, as it were, an excuse should they not work, or should they afterwards do something wrong. This, of course, is most profoundly false. Nothing that a man did yesterday excuses him today. Quite the reverse. If a man did nothing yesterday, no demands are made upon him today. If he did anything yesterday, it means that he must do more today. This certainly does not mean that it is better to do nothing. Whoever does nothing receives nothing. As I have said already, one of the first demands is sincerity. But there are different kinds of sincerity. There is clever sincerity and there is stupid sincerity, just as there is clever insincerity and stupid insincerity. Both stupid sincerity and stupid insincerity are equally mechanical. But if a man wishes to learn to be cleverly sincere, he must be sincere first of all with his teacher and with people who are senior to him in the work. This will be clever sincerity. But here it is necessary to note that sincerity must not become lack of considering. Lack of considering in relation to the teacher or in relation to those whom the teacher has appointed, as I have said already, destroys all possibility of any work. If he wishes to learn to be cleverly insincere, he must be insincere about the work, and he must learn to be silent when he ought to be silent with people outside it, who can neither understand nor appreciate it. But sincerity in the group is an absolute demand, because if a man continues to lie in the group in the same way as he lies to himself and to others in life, he will never learn to distinguish the truth from a lie. The second barrier is very often the conquest of fear. A man usually has many unnecessary imaginary fears. Lies and fears. This is the atmosphere in which an ordinary man lives. Just as the conquest of lying is individual, so also is the conquest of fear. Every man has fears of his own which are peculiar to him alone. These fears must first be found and then destroyed. The fears of which I speak are usually connected with the lies among which a man lives. You must realise that they have nothing in common with the fear of spiders or of mice or of a dark room, or with unaccountable nervous fears. The struggle against lying in oneself and the struggle against fears is the first positive work which a man begins to do. One must realise, in general, that positive efforts and even sacrifices in the work do not justify or excuse mistakes which may follow. On the contrary, things that could be forgiven in a man who has made no efforts and who has sacrificed nothing will not be forgiven in another who has already made great sacrifices. This seems to be unjust, but one must understand the law. There is, as it were, a separate account kept for every man. His efforts and sacrifices are written down on one side of the book, and his mistakes and misdeeds on the other side. What is written down on the positive side can never atone for what is written down on the negative side. What is recorded on the negative side can only be wiped out by the truth, that is to say, by an instant and complete confession to himself and to others, and above all to the teacher. If a man sees his fault but continues to justify himself, a small offence may destroy the result of whole years of work and effort. In the work, therefore, it is often better to admit one's guilt, even when one is not guilty. But this again is a delicate matter, and it must not be exaggerated. Otherwise the result will again be lying, and lying prompted by fear. On another occasion, speaking of groups, G said, "Do not think that we can begin straight away by forming a group. A group is a big thing. A group is begun for definite, concerted work, for a definite aim. I should have to trust you in this work, and you would have to trust me and one another. Then it would be a group. Until there is general work, it will only be a preparatory group. We shall prepare ourselves so it is in the course of time to become a group. And it is only possible to prepare ourselves to become a group by trying to imitate a group such as it ought to be. Imitating it inwardly, of course, not outwardly. What is necessary for this? First of all, you must understand that in a group, all are responsible for one another. A mistake on the part of one is considered as a mistake on the part of all. This is a law, and this law is well founded for, as you will see later, what one acquires is acquired also by all. The rule of common responsibility must be borne well in mind. It has another side also. Members of a group are responsible not only for the mistakes of others, but also for their failures. The success of one is the success of all. The failure of one is the failure of all. A grave mistake on the part of one, such as for instance the breaking of a fundamental rule, inevitably leads to the dissolution of the whole group. A group must work as one machine. The parts of the machine must know one another and help one another. In a group there can be no personal interest opposed to the interests of others, or opposed to the interests of the work. There can be no personal sympathies or antipathies which hinder the work. All the members of a group are friends and brothers, but if one of them leaves, and especially if he is sent away by the teacher, he ceases to be a friend and a brother, and at once becomes a stranger, as one who is cut off. It often becomes a very hard rule, but nevertheless it is necessary. People may be lifelong friends and may enter a group together. Afterwards one of them leaves. The other then has no right to speak to him about the work of the group. The man who has left feels hurt. He does not understand this, and they quarrel. In order to avoid this where relations such as husband and wife, mother and daughter and so on are concerned, we count them as one, that is, husband and wife are counted as one member of the group. Thus, if one of them cannot go on with the work and leaves, the other is considered guilty and must also leave. Furthermore, you must remember that I can help you only to the extent that you help me. Moreover, your help, especially at the beginning, will be reckoned not by actual results, which are almost certain to be nil, but by the number and the magnitude of your efforts. After this, G passed to individual tasks and to the definition of our chief faults. Then he gave us several definite tasks with which the work of our group began. Later, in 1917, when we were in the Caucasus, G once added several interesting observations to the general principles of the formation of groups. I think I must quote them here. "You take it all too theoretically," he said. "You ought to have known more by now. There is no particular benefit in the existence of groups in themselves, and there is no particular merit in belonging to groups. The benefit or usefulness of groups is determined by their results. The work of every man can proceed in three directions. He can be useful to the work, he can be useful to me, and he can be useful to himself. Of course, it is desirable that a man's work should produce results in all three directions. Failing this, one can be reconciled to two. For instance, if a man is useful to me, by this very fact he is useful also to the work. Or, if he is useful to the work, he is useful also to me. But if, let us say, a man is useful to the work and useful to me, but is not able to be useful to himself, This is much worse because it cannot last long. If a man takes nothing for himself and does not change, if he remains such as he was before, then the fact of his having by chance been useful for a short time is not placed to his credit, and, what is more important, his usefulness does not last for long. The work grows and changes. If a man himself does not grow or change, he cannot keep up with the work. The work leaves him behind, and then the very thing that was useful may begin to be harmful. I returned to St. Petersburg in the summer of 1916. Soon after our group, or preparatory group, has been formed, G spoke to us about efforts in connection with the tasks he set before us. "You must understand," he said, "that ordinary efforts do not count. Only super efforts count. And so it is always and in everything. Those who do not wish to make super efforts had better give up everything and take care of their health." "Cannot super efforts be dangerous?" asked one of the audience, who was usually particularly careful about his health. "Of course they can," said G, "but it is better to die making efforts to awaken than to live in sleep. That's one thing. For another thing, it is not so easy to die from efforts. We have much more strength than we think, but we never make use of it. You must understand one feature of the organisation of the human machine. A very important role in the human machine is played by a certain kind of accumulator. There are 2 small accumulators near each centre, filled with the particular substance necessary for the work of the given centre. In addition, there is in the organism a large accumulator which feeds the small ones. The small accumulators are connected together, and further, each of them is connected with the centre next to which it stands, as well as with the large accumulator. G drew a general diagram of the human machine and pointed out the positions of the large and small accumulators and the connections between them. "Accumulators work in the following way," he said. "Let us suppose that a man is working or is reading a difficult book and trying to understand it, in which case several rolls revolve in the thinking apparatus in his head. Or let us suppose that he is walking up a hill and is getting tired, in which case the rolls revolve in the moving centre. In the first instance, the intellectual centre, and in the second, the moving centre, draw the energy necessary for their work from the small accumulators. When an accumulator is nearly empty, a man feels tired. He would like to stop, to sit down if he is walking, to think of something else if he is solving a difficult problem. But quite unexpectedly he feels an inflow of strength, and he is once more able to walk or to work. This means that the centre has become connected with the second accumulator and is taking energy from it. Meanwhile, the first accumulator is refilling with energy from the large accumulator. The work of the centre goes on. The man continues to walk or to work. Sometimes a short rest is required to ensure this connection. Sometimes a shock, sometimes an effort. Anyway, the work goes on. After a certain time, the store of energy in the second accumulator also becomes exhausted. The man again feels tired. Again, an external shock, or a short rest, or a cigarette, or an effort, and he is connected with the first accumulator. But it may easily happen that the centre has drawn energy from the second accumulator so quickly that the first one has had no time to refill itself from the large accumulator and has taken only half the energy it can hold. It is only half full. Having become reconnected with the first accumulator, the centre begins to draw energy from it, while the second accumulator becomes connected with and draws energy from the large accumulator. But this time the first accumulator was only half full. The centre quickly exhausts its energy, and in the meantime the second accumulator has succeeded in getting only a quarter full. The centre becomes connected with it, swiftly exhausts all its energy and connects once more with the first accumulator, and so on. After a certain time the organism is brought to such a state that neither of the small accumulators has a drop of energy left. This time the man feels really tired. He almost falls down. He almost drops asleep, or else his organism becomes affected. He starts a headache, palpitations begin, or he feels sick. Then, suddenly, again a short rest, or an external shock, or an effort, brings a new flow of energy, and the man is once more able to think, to walk, or to work. This means that the centre has become connected directly to the large accumulator. The large accumulator contains an enormous amount of energy. Connected with the large accumulator, a man is literally able to perform miracles. But of course, if the roles continue to turn and energy which is made from air, food and impressions continues to pour out of the large accumulator faster than it pours in, then there comes a moment when the large accumulator is drained of all energy and the organism dies. But this happens very seldom. Usually the organism automatically stops working long before this. Special conditions are necessary to cause the organism to die exhausted of all its energy. In ordinary conditions, a man will fall asleep, or he will faint, or he will develop some internal complication which will stop the work a long time before the real danger. One need not therefore be afraid of efforts. The danger of dying from them is not at all great. It is much easier to die from inaction, from laziness, and from the fear of making efforts. Our aim, on the contrary, is to learn to connect the necessary centre with the large accumulator. So long as we are unable to do this, all our work will be wasted because we shall fall asleep before our efforts can give any kind of results. Small accumulators suffice for the ordinary everyday work of life, but for work on oneself, for inner growth, and for the efforts which are required of a man who enters the way, the energy from these small accumulators is not enough. We must learn how to draw energy straight from the large accumulator. This, however, is possible only with the help of the emotional centre. It is essential that this be understood. The connection with the large accumulator can be effected only through the emotional centre. The instinctive, moving and intellectual centres by themselves can feed only on the small accumulators. This is precisely what people do not understand. Therefore, their aim must be the development of the activity of the emotional centre. The emotional centre is an apparatus much more subtle than the intellectual centre, particularly if we take into consideration the fact that in the whole of the intellectual centre, the only parts that work is the formatory apparatus, and that many things are quite inaccessible to the intellectual centre. If anyone desires to know and to understand more than he actually knows and understands, he must remember that this new knowledge and this new understanding will come through the emotional centre and not through the intellectual centre. In addition to what he had said about accumulators, G made some very interesting remarks about yawning and about laughter. There are two incomprehensible functions of our organism inexplicable from the scientific point of view, he said. Although naturally science does not admit them to be inexplicable, these are yawning and laughter. Neither the one nor the other can be rightly understood and explained without knowing about accumulators and their role in the organism. You have noticed that you yawn when you are tired. This is especially noticeable, for instance, in the mountains, when a man who is unaccustomed to them yawns almost continually while he is ascending a mountain. Yawning is the pumping of energy into the small accumulators. When they empty too quickly, that is, when one of them has no time to fill up while the other is being emptied, yawning becomes almost continuous. There are certain disease conditions which can cause stoppage of the heart when a man wishes but is not able to yawn. And other conditions are known when something goes wrong with the pump, causing it to work without effect, when a man yawns the whole time but does not pump in any energy. The study and the observation of yawning from this point of view may reveal much that is new and interesting. Laughter is also directly connected with accumulators, but laughter is the opposite function to yawning. It is not pumping in but pumping out, that is, the pumping out and the discarding of superfluous energy collected in the accumulators. Laughter does not exist in all centres, but only in centres divided into two halves, positive and negative. If I have not yet spoken of this in detail, I shall do so when we come to a more detailed study of the centres. At present we shall take only the intellectual centre. There can be impressions which fall at once on two halves of the centre, and produce at once a sharp yes and no. Such a simultaneous yes and no produces a kind of convulsion in the centre and, Being unable to harmonise and digest these two opposite impressions of one fact, the centre begins to throw out in the form of laughter the energy which flows into it from the accumulator whose turn it is to supply it. In another instance, it happens that in the accumulator there is collected too much energy which the centre cannot manage to use up. Then the most ordinary impression can be received as double. That is, it may fall at once on the two halves of the centre and produce laughter that is the discarding of energy. You must understand that I am only giving you an outline. You must remember that both yawning and laughter are very contagious. This shows that they are essentially functions of the instinctive and the moving centres. "Why is laughter so pleasant?" asked someone. "Because," G answered, "laughter relieves us of superfluous energy, which if it remained unused might become negative, that is poison. We always have plenty of this poison in us. Laughter is the antidote. But this antidote is necessary only so long as we are unable to use all the energy for useful work. It is said of Christ that he never laughed, and indeed you will find in the Gospels no indication or mention of the fact that at any time Christ laughed. But there are different ways of not laughing. There are people who do not laugh because they are completely immersed in negative emotions, in malice, in fear, in hatred, in suspicion. And there may be others who do not laugh because they cannot have negative emotions. Understand one thing. In the higher centres there can be no laughter, because in higher centres there is no division, and no yes and no.